The road looked like deliverance and doom at the same time. A thin grey ribbon snaking between wet hedgerows. A few farm tracks disappearing into mist. The air sharp with the smell of damp leaves and burnt oil. In that narrow corridor, a German colonel made a decision that felt like salvation. He ordered his men to seize gas liquid momentum, ours in steel jerry cans, because without it, every plan reduced to a sketch on a map, every arrow on the operations overlay curled back into itself and died. He called it a pause to replenish, a small thing on paper. To the men who wrenched open Allied drums and siphoned fuel into waiting tanks, it felt like the war resuming on their terms. Engines coughed, then roared. Tracks snapped forward. For half an hour the noise sounded like confidence. In the exacting light of logistics, the move was something else, an admission that audacity had outrun arithmetic. The colonel could read a supply ledger as well as a map, and he knew fuel was time. A panzer battalion drank kilometers in gulps, a convoy drank patience, a headquarters drank the future. He seized gas because the day demanded it, and because the larger machine behind him could no longer promise what had once felt guaranteed. Somewhere behind the sound of idling engines, he heard the hiss of reality. Germany's capacity to make, repair, deliver and replace had fallen beneath the speed of loss. The seizure was a breath held against that truth. What actually happened is simple to state and hard to forget. A German spearhead, light on fuel and heavier in resolve, intercepted and captured Allied petroleum stores along a narrow sector of road. The unit pushed forward, believing the sudden transfusion might unlock a local breakthrough. It did not. The fuel bought hours, not days. Miles, not a campaign. The narrative shrank as quickly as it had expanded, and the colonel who had authorized the grab and signed the order watched the speed bleed away in the way it always does in a long war, not in one dramatic failure, but in a series of smaller, inevitable exhaustions. The opening picture matters because it resists myth. This is not the tale of a single daring officer swinging the arc of strategy with a clever theft. It is the tale of arithmetic. Wartime fuel is captured potential. It turns stored heat into motion, and motion into surprise. But potential is different from capacity. Potential lives inside drums. Capacity lives inside factories, refineries, railheads, repair shops, traffic offices, and the quiet competence of clerks who reconcile tonnage and time. Potential lets you sprint. Capacity lets you keep going. The colonel's decision captured potential. The Allied system waiting beyond the hedgerows embodied capacity. He did not know everything, but he knew enough. The reports piling up on the map table told him refineries at home were hurt, and synthetic plants that once promised independence now needed protection the army could not spare. He had learned to read the scars on the rails, the way locomotives arrived late and light, the way freight cars drifted into sidings for want of parts. He had learned to measure company confidence by the condition of boots and the sound of transmission housings at idle. He had learned that a unit running on captured fuel runs on borrowed promises. You do not control the grade of the gasoline. You do not control the time of arrival. You do not control the next 10 kilometers of road. So the order was not swagger. It was triage. The colonel's men moved with practiced economy, quick security cordons, a short interrogation of drivers, a brisk transfer from Allied drums to German cans, a hasty chalk mark on turret skirts to track allocation. He walked the line as fuel sloshed into tanks and half-tracks. He slapped a glacis with a gloved hand as the crew chief shouted that the filters would take it, that the engine would tolerate the mix. He did not tell anyone that he had already played. The next 5 moves in his head, and each move ended at the same wall. Resupply was now a question of chance more than plan. This is the fulcrum of the story. The drama on the roadside is obvious, the tension of a raid, the question of whether Allied patrols would appear out of the fog, the pulse of engines on the edge of stalling. The deeper point is quieter and more final. The colonel's authority reached far enough to seize gas and restart vehicles. It did not reach into factories over the horizon. It did not spin up assembly lines, reopen refineries, repopulate maintenance depots, or repair bridges. He could reanimate momentum for a day. The system on the other side could replace losses for a season. The more he studied that contrast, the less he mistook success for victory. When the column rolled, it rolled beautifully. Tanks coaxed the road into giving them speed. Half-tracks tucked in close. Motorcycles ran like slender hounds at the flanks. For a handful of hours, the unit behaved like doctrine promised it could. They found gaps, used spur roads, kept radios short. They rounded up prisoners, questioned locals, handed out admonitions to conserve fuel and watch the gauges. The colonel should have felt vindication. Instead, he felt the weight of every kilometre ticking against him, like a metronome that measured opportunity in falling increments. The first warning came from the sky, as it so often did now. Allied aircraft did not arrive in the sudden, overwhelming packs of the previous summer, but they did arrive, and when they passed, the road froze. Every vehicle camouflaged itself as best it could. Tarps came out, branches appeared on fenders, canvas draped over gun tubes. Waiting is the slowest form of expenditure and the easiest to ignore in reports. The engines were off to save fuel, but the seconds burned anyway, burned in nerves and in the unused minutes of daylight. When the air quieted and the column moved again, the colonel felt the odds shift, from daring to delay. By evening, the seized fuel was history inside the tanks, transformed into heat and motion, and a small widening on the map. The colonel could point to that widening. He could show it to a superior and call it proof of concept. He could even believe, for a breath, that more of the same might build into something greater. But the ledger did not care about these hopes. Somewhere else, Allied trucks were pushing up graded roads under strict traffic control. Somewhere else, depot officers signed off on releases of fresh drums to replace the ones taken that morning. Somewhere else, a chain of scheduled transports turned one loss into a brief line item and then erased it with routine. What actually happened ends where all such episodes end, with the truth that speed without sustainment is performance art. The colonel seized gas and extended his reach by hours. In that same span, the other side regenerated. When he looked at the map that night, he saw that he had created a story worth telling and a lesson worth keeping. The story is that courage can create a local shape in the war. The lesson is that capacity decides whether that shape matters beyond sundown. In the quiet after the engines stopped, he understood that the war had tilted in the only way that counts toward the side that could lose and replace, and then lose and replace again, faster than its opponent could even count. He did not write a confession. He did not summon anyone to hear his reflections. He simply nodded when his adjutant mentioned that more fuel would be needed by mid-morning, and he watched a driver's eyes as the man asked whether the day's mix would continue tomorrow. The colonel said yes because leaders say yes, and because the machines needed motion. Later, when he finally allowed himself the grace of honesty, he accepted what the roadside had already told him. You can seize gas, you cannot seize capacity. The first wins a day, the second wins a war. The day began, as many late war days began, with a grey sky that compressed sound and made the hedgerows seem closer than they were. Before dawn, reconnaissance parties returned, with word of a small Allied convoy turned around on a narrow lane, of drums on trucks, of a depot forward of where any prudent planner would have placed it. By 6 o'clock the colonel had his decision. He set the column in motion with a kind of alert quiet, the kind that makes men check their straps twice and listen for the rhythm of engines like they are listening to a clock. The first stage of the day was all approach, the slow unfurling of momentum toward an objective not yet seen but felt in the muscles of the drivers and in the way the company commanders rode a little higher in their seats. The seizure itself unfolded in a rush so brief it seemed like a skipped heartbeat in retrospect. The lead elements arrived faster than the convoy expected, and speed did what stealth could not. Guards were taken into custody, drivers disarmed. The sour metallic smell of gasoline erupted as drum bungs came loose and siphon hoses went to work. It was not elegant, it was efficient. Teams formed almost instinctively, some to secure the road, some to shade engines and watch the sky, some to tilt drums and count. The colonel walked the line without drama, issuing just enough instruction to remind everyone that this was not improvisation but adaptation within a plan. The second stage of the day, capture and transfer, ended as quickly as prudence allowed. Idling lasted only long enough for filters to stop coughing and for the most delicate engines to accept the mixture. As the column pushed off, the morning was still young, and the promise of distance remained real. This third period of the day belonged to forward motion, the exhilaration of vehicles that had threatened to become static displays roaring back into the vocabulary of war. They advanced on roads that could barely be called roads, over culverts that deserved to be mapped simply so they could later receive thanks. They fanned out to test the status of crossroads and to sniff for ambush. Radios stayed terse. The colonel's notebook remained shut. He preferred to join the front of the formation and feel in his bones what paper would only dilute. By early afternoon, the war reminded them of its own schedule. Aircraft circled, distant at first and then too present to ignore. Each appearance forced the same ritual: halt, conceal, rehearse again the patience that modern battle demands. The fourth stage interruption was not a single block but a series of pauses, each of which drained a little more time than anyone admitted aloud. Time, like fuel, is impossible to replace at the front. The men ate in singles and pairs while keeping one hand on the cool metal of their vehicles. The colonel attempted to calculate what the delays meant. He knew how long it took to prime an attack, how long it took to repair a track, how long it took before word of their movement would shape the thoughts of men beyond the next ridge. He did not yet know how long it would take the other side to replace what he had just taken. He would learn the answer by nightfall, not through a report but through the way the resistance ahead refused to thin. Late afternoon converted optimism into diligence. The fifth stage commitment was the time when men add care to courage. They husbanded fuel like misers, let vehicles roll on declines, kept speed smooth to spare transmissions. Reconnaissance returned with the sobering truth that the net of Allied movement had retightened by the hour. Patrols crisscrossed in predictable triangles. Dispatch riders appeared on the expected stretches of good road. Trucks moved with the kind of discipline that comes from a thick rulebook and a leadership culture that punishes improvisation. The colonel recognized the pattern. It meant the loss on the ledger had already been met and recorded elsewhere. It meant the placeless gap that opened when he seized the convoy had been stitched closed by procedure. Evening arrived with a slow bleed of color from the sky, and with it came the phase that all commanders dread because it is invisible in archives and in after-action reports. The sixth stage stall does not announce itself with panic or shouting. It arrives as a gentle fatigue, as a series of small choices shaded toward caution, a slightly longer halt to check a bearing, a quiet discussion about whether to commit a reserve vehicle to a secondary road, the decision to let a maintenance team chase a coolant leak before it becomes an engine casualty. None of these are wrong. Together they are decisive. The colonel felt it like a hand at the back of his neck. He let the day stand. He ordered perimeters and camouflage and the simplest version of security that would do something useful. He wrote down 3 lines in his notebook: fuel acceptable through noon, enemy air sporadic, disruptive. Allied road net tight again by last light. In the night, sleep came in slices, and with each slice the colonel replayed the hours and measured his earlier gamble against the only standard that matters in war: what can be done tomorrow. The timeline, so dramatic at breakfast, had settled into the firm clay of continuity by midnight. The seventh and final stage reckoning was not tragic. It was ordinary and absolute. He had taken fuel and turned it into forward arrows on a map. The other side had squared the loss with receipts and restored the equilibrium that favored them. The colonel did not need a report to understand. The timeline of the day drew a clear picture. Seizure could create energy. It could not create endurance. The next morning would therefore look familiar, which is another way of saying it would look harder. If you stand close enough to a tank and press your palm to its armor on a cold morning, the metal will not tell you how much it eats. A ledger will. A medium tank, properly tuned and pushed across poor roads, can drink more fuel in a day than a small village can burn in a week, and still ask for more. The colonel knew this in his bones because he had learned to talk to quartermasters as if they were artillerymen. He asked about consumption the way gunners ask about elevation. He treated a day's worth of gasoline like a schedule of fire missions. When his men took Allied drums and fed them into the mouths of German engines, he did not see triumph. He saw a number scrawled across his horizon. The numbers mattered because they connect the intimate to the industrial. A drum is not a symbol, it is a fixed quantity that either meets a requirement or does not. A battalion of armoured vehicles, moving with intent, produces a predictable curve of need. The colonel had internalized those curves as if they were liturgical responses. He could quote how far a column might reach if it kept to careful speeds, how much the grade of fuel would shift the behavior of an engine, how many hours a maintenance section could buy by clever filtration and careful throttle. He had watched filters clog with the fine grit of months of fighting, watched crew chiefs listen to an engine as a doctor listens to a heart, watched drivers develop the muscle memory that lets them stretch a litre farther than the manual allows. Each observation fed into his private arithmetic. The theatre around him had its own numbers written in an ink much darker than his. There were the figures that never showed up on chalkboards at the roadside, refinery outputs, allocation ratios, the tonnage of tanker cars that still reached their destination and the tonnage that did not, the frequency with which rail bridges had to be rebuilt or replaced with temporary spans. Far behind the hedgerows where his men moved hoses from drum to drum, planners with clean hands and sleepless eyes maintained a discipline of flows. They did so with a confidence born of depth, the kind of depth that turns a loss into a lesson rather than a crisis. When the colonel authorized the seizure, he stepped briefly into that world of flows and tried to write his own revision into the ledger. In response, the opposing system added a line, made a few calls, shuffled schedules, and shrugged. He felt the difference in the texture of work. His men labored with immediacy. Drag, pour, test, seal, mark. The system he opposed labored with regularity. Dispatch, receive, reconcile, repeat. His men spoke in shouts. The system spoke in schedules. His men used chalk on fenders, paint on cans, and muscle on drums. The system used forms and warehouses and rules about which roads belong to which vehicles at which hours. Both kinds of work are honourable. Only one can survive the stress of months on end without losing its shape. The colonel carried with him a personal fast facts sheet that had no title and needed no headings. It lived in his habits. He knew how far the lead company could reach on half its nominal load and still retain the energy to fight. He knew which engines tolerated mixed fuel cleanly and which required the careful addition of particular additives to behave. He knew that if he asked a driver to run just a little hotter for just a little longer, the driver would give him that because that is what drivers do when asked by men they trust. He also knew that the bill would come due in the form of open engine hatches by the roadside, men crouched with tools in their hands, and a quiet that gathered like mist as a road emptied of moving steel. The depots on the other side built their own fast facts into routine. They knew how quickly a drum could be replaced, how often a truck could make its round trip within a traffic plan that forbade heroics, how many spare tires would find their way to the correct repair yard without someone having to plead. They had rules that turned discipline into speed because those rules prevented the kind of improvisation that steals energy from tomorrow to make today look good. The colonel, as a student of both courage and consequence, envied the way routine became a multiplier for them. He had tried to build something similar within his shrinking resources, and the result was the competence he saw in his men at the roadside. But competence cannot replace capacity any more than courage can replace ordnance. The numbers insisted on that truth with the patience of a bookkeeper who knows the end of the month will always arrive. His private summary took the form of a sentence he never spoke aloud, because speaking it aloud would have sounded like resignation. One dump is not a plan. One seizure is not a supply line. One good day on the road is not a way to reverse a season. He wrote the day's achievements into the war diary with the respect they deserved. He allowed the adjectives to keep their dignity. He recorded the fuel captured without diminishing the effort that had gone into it. He did not adorn the entry with prophecy. He knew that the next day would arrive and ask the same questions in the same language. How far? How fast? How many? How soon? Those questions are not impressed by legends of individual initiative. They listen only to trains, to trucks, to drums rolled off ramps by men who will do the same thing tomorrow and the next day, and the day after that. If there is a panel of facts to be read here, it does not live on a screen. It lives in the way a war machine breathes. A modern army inhales at depots and exhales at the front. The colonel tried to borrow an extra lungful and sprint. The other side maintained a steady, measured breathing that did not care about the tempo of any single unit on any single road. The facts that matter most are therefore not surprising. Consumption defeats optimism. Discipline outruns daring over distance, and every hour saved by a clever raid can be erased by a schedule executed on time, by men who are not tired because the system protects them from becoming tired. The colonel accepted this without bitterness. Acceptance can look like defeat from the outside. From the inside, it looks like clarity. Spread across the hood of a staff car, the map looked like a favorite lie. Lines curved in helpful ways. Contour shadings hinted at paths that were more suggestion than terrain. Villages appeared as neat squares that seemed to invite flanking moves. The colonel was enough of a romantic to feel the pull of those lies, and enough of a realist to treat his map like a starting point rather than an oracle. He knew the road network in front of him had been built for farmers, not for armoured battalions, and he knew that every crossroads was a riddle of time. A unit could arrive at a pretty junction on a map and find muddy wheel ruts, a single workable lane, and a culvert that laughed at the weight of modern war. He weighted the paper with a compass and a wrench because those were the two tools he trusted most. The compass let him align ambition with bearings. The wrench reminded him that every line he drew would have to be carried by axles, gears, and cooling systems that were more honest than any set of arrows. He chose his route the way experienced men choose their words, with an ear for what would be understood and a caution for what would be misunderstood. He protected the column from the seductions of straight lines with a doctrine of curves. Never overcommit to a perfect road. Always keep a hand on a spur that can absorb a surprise. Always refuse to believe that the shortest path is best if the best path gives your vehicles the energy to fight when they arrive. The math intruded as soon as he began to translate intent into movement. Fuel burn rises with speed and with friction, and with the small, constant corrections that drivers make as they coax heavy machines through tight spaces. The colonel had once enjoyed the purity of doctrine. Reserve your right to accelerate where it matters. Consume fuel at the moment of Bow's decision. Now he lived with a more pedestrian arithmetic. He taught his drivers to roll lightly on declines, to leave extra space so they did not have to brake and waste momentum, to keep revs in a band that honoured the age of their engines. He asked his company commanders to think not about the next ridge, but about the next 10 kilometres of surface, and then about the next 10 after that. He traded the adrenaline of speed for the quiet wealth of range. Maps tell lies of distance. Math tells truths of time. The colonel read both in tandem. He could lay out on paper the elegant thrust that would punish an inattentive enemy. Then he could place on that same paper the ghost of the day after that thrust, when maintenance would come due, when filters would demand attention, when the officers who smiled at the evening's debrief would begin to rub at the corners of their eyes because fatigue insists on interest. He accepted that he was now commanding in a world where the second day mattered more than the first, and where victory could not be found at the tip of an arrow but only at the base of a ledger column that refused to turn red. The road net opposed him even when it yielded. Small bridges reduced traffic to a crawl. Sharp turns forced vehicles to queue and breathe their own fumes. Villages that looked quiet from a distance revealed the particular danger of stone walls that channeled movement and amplified noise. He understood that every delay is a tax. Some taxes are paid in fuel, some are paid in surprise, all are paid in time. He moved escort motorcycles forward to preview the geometry of risk. He sent a half-track ahead not to fight, but to feel the road with its tires like a blind man feels a face. He valued the report that said, simply, "It is narrow, more than he valued the report that offered ambitious estimates of how long it would take to get through. The other side's map lived inside their rules. They did not improvise where they did not have to. They assigned roads to directions, set hours for movements, and gave to their convoy commanders a book that punished creativity. The colonel had once mocked such bureaucracy. Now he envied what it produced. A flow that made replacement normal and made panic rare. He saw the effect at the margins of his own advance. Every time he thought the gaps would widen for him, they did not. Every time he thought a crossroads would be empty, it was not. He began to feel as if he were walking across an icy pond and hearing the small cracks form, not beneath his own feet but far off, in a direction he could not influence. He did not despair. He adjusted. He painted the day in tones that would leave him options at dusk. He set small objectives he could hold without bleeding his reserve. He kept his engineers close because he understood that a blown culvert at the wrong moment could steal more from him than an ambush. He decided to measure success not by the length of the line he moved across the map, but by the number of vehicles he would have in service the next morning. He began to think of victory as a question about tomorrow's starting line rather than today's finish line. This change in mindset did not betray tactical talent. It refined it. Tactical genius, untempered by strategic math, is theatre. It delights, it does not endure. The colonel had no taste for theatre. He wanted something that could survive contact with day 2 and day 3 and the day after that. The map invited him to commit bravado. The math invited him to commit wisdom. Each kilometre travelled underlined the same sentence. The engines will have their say, and the engines speak in numbers. He listened to them carefully, because he knew that in the end he would have to live not with the poetry of a beautiful arrow, but with the prose of a long road that allowed his men to fight in the morning. He folded the map at last, light with hands that smelled faintly of fuel and metal, and with a mind that accepted a truth he could neither escape nor defeat. Audacity can turn a morning, only capacity can turn a war. Far from the hedgerows where men rolled drums against steel and listened for the tremor of engines, another machine moved with a steadiness that did not need to brag. It lived in rail yards and depots, in motor pools and warehouses, in the quiet grammar of forms filled without drama and checked without haste. It did not depend on heroism to function, and that was its power. At a port, cranes marched across a skyline like patient metronomes, while cargo nets swung out of holds, each net a parcel of future miles. Forklifts hummed between painted lanes. Every crate bore markings that told it where it belonged before a human voice had to intervene. Such markings do not stir the blood, but they rescue a plan from chance. The machine owned its language. Pallets carried parts listed in alphanumeric codes that could be understood in any depot because the codes were the same everywhere. Tires arrived with their companions, tubes, valves, repair kits, and the unglamorous instructions that kept them from failing early. Engines came sealed against weather in the kind of crating that treats the world like an adversary. Even the paper had a duty, thick enough to resist oil and grease, thin enough to fold into the pockets of men who would read it beside open hatches. In every corner of this world, replacement was assumed, not prayed for. When an engine failed, the question was not whether a new one existed, but how many hours the road net demanded before it arrived. The machine owned its habits as well. A truck driver did not decide his route on a feeling. He obeyed a traffic discipline that had no appetite for improvisation. Certain roads flowed one way on certain days. Certain bridges tolerated certain weights at certain hours. Staging areas gathered convoys like hands gather water, shaping flow into a controllable stream. An officer with a clipboard could move 1,000 tons farther than an officer with a speech because the first had roots and signatures and the authority of a system that punished deviation. None of this was decorative. It was the difference between a column that runs out of fuel at dusk and a column that reaches its line at dusk and still fights at dawn. Maintenance proved the machine's character. At a depot, vehicles did not wait on a miracle. They rotated through scheduled inspections that caught small failures before those failures could become roadside sermons. Filters were replaced because it was time, not because someone heard an engine plead. Bearings were regreased because the rules said they must be, not because a driver lifted a hood in worry. Condemnation was not an insult, but a choice that kept an army from betting tomorrow on a part that had already given its best. Mechanics were trained to treat solvable problems as routine, and routine as sacred. A unit returning from the line did not beg for attention. It took a ticket, rolled to the correct bay, and watched men perform a choreography that looked like calm, even when it was urgency in disguise. Interchangeability stitched the whole together. An axle pulled from a crate in one depot matched a housing fitted in another. A gearbox signed out in the morning in one time zone had the same part number as the gearbox signed in at twilight in a different one. This sameness defied romance and guaranteed resilience. When a truck broke on a road that did not have a name, the part that it needed could be called for with a number, not a description, and someone in a warehouse 100 kilometers away could meet that need without guessing. That is how a machine rescues men from suffering more than the minimum a war demands. The machine treated information like fuel. Reports flowed daily, not as alarms but as pulse checks, and they moved upward, layered with context instead of excuses. When losses mounted on one route, dispatch found another before a letter of complaint had time to warm a desk. When a unit's consumption curve bent upward, investigation began with curiosity, not blame, because early curiosity preserved more power than late anger. The officers who administered this world were not saints. They were people who had learned that predictability is the most generous gift a system can give to those who fight. Predictability lets courage be spent where it matters, rather than on the small crises that breed in disorganization. None of this made the machine immune to friction. Ports clogged, weather-bullied schedules, rail bridges demanded fresh timber or new steel, and punished the clerk who miscalculated. Yet even these failures occurred within a framework that assumed correction. A derailed freight did not freeze the flow. It triggered a set of responses that had already been rehearsed. A bombed siding did not leave an orphaned convoy. The system sent engineers with timber and cranes with cables, and officers who possessed the authority to say which loads moved first. When the colonel's men siphoned fuel from captured drums, the loss traveled through this ecosystem as a numerical ripple, not as a wound. A requisition opened. A convoy composition changed. A depot released reserve stock. Replacement became a sentence finished before the paragraph that held the loss had even ended. The scale of the machine could be seen in small acts. A clerk stamping a form correctly 1,000 times may look like drudgery. It is actually pressure converted into continuity. A driver who follows a speed limit that seems timid to a fighter at the front is not timid. He is obedient to the physics that keep a tire from exploding and a convoy from shattering into well-meant fragments. A mechanic who discards a borderline part is not wasteful. He is faithful to a rule that prevents catastrophe from disguising itself as thrift. Taken together, these acts create a moral of their own. They say that the lives of men at the front are best served by systems that do not tempt fate. The machine's great virtue was that it did not ask belief to do the work of capacity. It never required a commander to imagine inventory into existence. It never excused an empty tank with a story about how hard everyone had tried. It simply met needs with volume and precision. When the colonel measured his world against this one, he did not feel shame. He felt the coolness of reality. He could move his pieces with tact and bravery, but the other side could replenish the board. Every time he attempted to steal days with an act of daring, the machine responded by making days, and the making of days is the closest thing to sovereignty in a long war. In that sense, the machine did not defeat him, it absorbed him. His raid became a line item, and then a memory. His hard-won kilometers required a reaction, and the reaction arrived by timetable. He could praise his men without lying, and still acknowledge that they had labored against an opponent whose most dangerous quality was not cunning but continuity. Nothing silences bravado like continuity. It turns noise into background and crisis into accounting. It let the other side move through the months with the implacable calm of a tide, lifting one beach after another until the shoreline of possibility had been redrawn. The colonel carried in his head a catalogue of limits, not because he was pessimistic, but because he was the sort of professional who understands that knowing the edges of a thing is the only way to move inside it without breaking it. He knew the refineries that had once promised to loosen the grip of fuel scarcity now lived under a sky that was never empty. He knew that synthetic plants turned coal and chemistry into liquid mobility at a rate too fragile to survive their own success. The more the front demanded, the more those plants attracted the kind of attention that ends in sirens and smoke. He knew that rail, the oldest friend of mass, had become undependable in a way that made schedule a suggestion. Trains still moved, but they moved late and light, and sometimes they did not move at all. His constraints had texture. A truck shortage is not a statistic in a field note. It is the sight of perfectly serviceable men walking beside overloaded wagons because the few functioning vehicles must carry ammunition instead of them. It is the decision to assign your best drivers to the worst vehicles because the worst vehicles are the ones that will punish inexperience and strand everyone. It is the gentle theft of mechanics from one unit to keep another on the road, an act that feels clever for a day and devastating after a week. He looked at the motor pool and saw not inventory but a field hospital, triage, gallows humour, and the bureaucracy of choosing which patient gets the last working part. He knew the horse never vanished. Men today like to tell stories in which machines replaced animals cleanly and forever. The colonel did not have time for stories. He had time for harness and feed and rest cycles. Horse teams hauled guns and carried the unglamorous burdens that trucks could not be spared to carry. Horses have virtues. They also have appetites, and appetites compete. Every kilogram of feed that moved forward had to share space with shells and fuel. He ran that arithmetic until it pressed against his temples. Horses allowed him to be brave in one place and prudent in another, and sometimes the choices they forced upon him came disguised as tradition when they were actually logistics. Air always wrote the preface to his day. There were mornings when the sky seemed charitable, and afternoons when it reminded him that modern war reaches down. Bridges mattered less for their spans, and more for the hours they stole when they fell. A bridge blown at the wrong time did not merely demand timber and labour, it demanded patience he could not afford. Detours channeled him onto roads where the margins died under the repeated punishment of tracks and tyres, so that each kilometre felt like a wager against a road's last shred of coherence. He learned to read shoulders and crowns the way he read a man's face, for signs of weakness, of stress, of pending collapse. Spare parts became a kind of weather. Some days a shipment arrived and lifted morale by existing, and for an afternoon the maintenance bay sounded like optimism. More days were lean. Men learned to cannibalize because cannibalization is the grammar of those who refuse to quit. A half-dozen vehicles gave up a component so that one might rejoin the line, and each donation conferred a sense of righteousness that never quite cancelled the knowledge that the bill would come due. Cannibalization builds the illusion of health. It also builds a graveyard of partial machines that mock one's efforts with their silent abundance of unusable almosts. He did not blame his mechanics for their ingenuity. He blamed the math that trapped their ingenuity in a narrowing loop. Fuel quality formed its own boundary. The mix captured at the roadside tasted different to engines built for a different standard. Filters worked overtime. Carburetors demanded attention at inconvenient moments. A driver with a good ear could coax another half hour from a reluctant power plant, but such coaxing has a cost measured in things that break just shy of a safe place to fix them. The colonel had taught himself never to ask a machine for more than it could give twice. He let his drivers practice prudence as a form of pride, and the result was range when others would have burned hope as if hope could be poured from a can. Doctrine itself hardened into a limit. Orders from above still promised elastic defense and short, sharp counterblows, the kind of maneuver that turns a map into a stage for talent. He loved such ideas when he read them as a younger man. Now he treated them with the respect due to museum pieces. A counterblow without fuel is language, pretending to be action. Elastic defense without mobility is a fortune cookie. He needed tasks that matched means, and the more candid he became about that need, the more he felt like a translator living between two dialects. What headquarters wished to be true, and what Axel Grease swore was true. Even courage can become a constraint when it is the only tool left in reach. His men had no shortage of it. They would dismount under fire to pull a disabled vehicle out of a kill zone. They would carry jerry cans across open ground because the line would move if they reached the engine in time. But courage that fills the gaps left by missing parts and failing schedules becomes a currency that devalues with use. Spend enough of it, and you are not richer. You are only more accustomed to spending. He husbanded bravery the way he husbanded fuel, because both, once burned, are gone. At night, when the perimeter settled and the radio net calmed, he thought about limits as lessons rather than as a sentence. Limits teach range. They teach the cost of each decision with a specificity that fortune never provides. They are harsh teachers and honest ones, and in their honesty there is a kind of grace. He took from them not despair, but the narrow, accurate hope that comes from doing the next correct thing. He would move at first light, because motion still mattered. He would protect his engines, because engines are the lungs of movement. He would write orders that acknowledged the world he actually commanded, not a world he wished to inherit. The war would not reward him for truth, but it would punish him for lies, and he had no desire to lose men to a sentence he could edit. Stories prefer heroes to ledgers, and in the telling of later years, the raid for fuel might grow extra shine. People will say that elite formations could outfight arithmetic, that captured supplies change the ratio of fate, that quality overcomes quantity if the quality is pure enough and the will is sharp. The colonel did not live inside stories. He lived inside days. Each day scraped away a layer of belief until belief learned to look like discipline. He watched the idea that a single haul of fuel could turn a map soften into what it always had been, a wish with good manners. It is tempting to imagine that superior engineering eclipses volume. A beautiful engine is indeed a beautiful thing, and machines that fit together with the precision of a clock inspire loyalty. But even clocks need winding, and machines built to a high polish demand a scale of support that becomes a liability when the world refuses to be gentle. A company that can repair a reliable, ordinary truck in hours will cover more ground than a company that must romance a sophisticated system through its ailments. The colonel did not despise sophistication. He eyed it with the reserve of a man who has asked a machine to work in the rain, in mud, on roads that punishes precision and rewards robustness. People also say that daring compensates for depletion. Daring can. It can crack a line, spook an opponent, seize a dump, and capture a story. Daring is a spark, and sparks have started great fires. But daring that depends on replenishment from the enemy is a drama that repeats once and then ends. The colonel did not quit using daring. He relocated it from the forefront of his plan to the joints where a little surprise magnifies an existing strength. He dared to move early, to break less on a dry stretch, to commit a reserve when the road allowed speed to act like an ally. He stopped daring the arithmetic to be merciful. There is another comfortable claim, that the other side's abundance made its men soft. The colonel had no evidence for that. He saw instead that abundance carefully managed made men calm. Calm soldiers waste less. Calm drivers wreck fewer vehicles. Calm quartermasters do not pad their requests or imagine enemies in paperwork. Calmness born of confidence in the system is not softness. It is the most dangerous mood an army can achieve because it allows aggression to be measured rather than manic. He taught his own men to be calm by telling them the truth. Calmness survived in their unit, even when abundance did not. A final, soothing tale suggests that a single dramatic blow can break a rhythm so thoroughly that the system on the other side will gasp and forget its own nature. The colonel had tried to see his seizure through that lens. For a few hours he allowed the possibility that shock would metastasize into paralysis. Instead, he watched how routine reasserted itself. The loss he inflicted became paperwork, answered by other paperwork. Trucks adjusted, schedules bent and straightened. Patrols met where the patrols were supposed to meet. Rhythm did not snap. It absorbed the blow and continued, slightly altered, still itself. He respected that more than he resented it. He envied it the way a man envies a neighbor's good roof during a long rain. In the end, the reckoning did not come in sentences with exclamation points. It came in the measured language of operations, a grammar of verbs that allow no protest. March, halt, conceal, refuel, move, engage, repair, report. He made peace with the verbs he could control and stopped pretending he held sway over the nouns he could not summon: factories, tankers, convoys, depots. When he compared faiths, he found that the only creed that survived contact was the one that honored cause and effect. To believe otherwise was to ask his men to bleed for a romance. He had no appetite for that. The raid, therefore, entered his memory not as a miracle but as a mirror. It showed him the face of the war he was actually fighting, a contest of endurance shaped by institutions as much as by individuals. He could be brilliant and fail, because the structure that supported his opponent refused to tire. He could be ordinary and succeed where the structure on his side held. The myth that genius alone can rescue a failing apparatus evaporated in the warmth of a single afternoon behind the wheel, listening to an engine turn fuel into the incremental victory of another kilometer. He decided that his remaining days in command would honor this revelation. He would use daring precisely, like a scalpel, and he would beg, borrow, and build routine wherever he could, because routine makes bravery cheap and therefore more plentiful. Every army has commanders. Fewer have custodians. The colonel learned that battles are decided by the first and wars by the second. Custodianship lives in the offices that most people skip on their way to the map room. It lives where the movement of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts is argued with the intensity other men reserve for the movement of regiments. On the other side of the hedgerows, custodianship wore a formal face. Theatre logistics staff rubbed shoulders with port commanders and rail schedulers, and together they made rules that looked unyielding and proved elastic in exactly the ways they needed to be. Authority sat where tonnage met time, and the men who held that authority did not apologize for the power to decide which unit's thirst would be quenched first. Inside that structure, decisions were not mysterious. A convoy moving inland did so because a table had been filled the night before with the names of depots, the loads they would release, and the roads they would own until midnight. A truck with a broken spring did not plead its case on the radio. It rolled to a bay whose mechanics had seen that spring 100 times and would see it 100 more. A column out of fuel did not howl at the moon. It received a schedule and a point on a map with time slots as rigid as rails. When a field commander asked for more than his allocation, the answer might be yes, but the yes would be a calculation, not a favor. This made friends slowly and victories quickly. On the colonel's side, authority scattered. Fuel allocations had to thread their way through appeals and personalities. Rail capacity competed with the demands of a front that could not decide if it preferred a bold arrow or a defensive curve. Depot officers fought the same war every day with fewer tools, and their victories were invisible because preventing a shortage does not photograph. Men of talent did their best within this fog of permissions. They triaged with honor and invented with care. They also lost time to negotiations that felt noble and felt necessary, and were, in their slow accretion, fatal. A system attains character when it chooses who may say no. The colonel's world permitted too many polite refusals and too few punctual deliveries. He came to understand that governance in war is not a question about who wears which rank on the shoulder. It is a question about which office may convert a request into a movement. In the tidy world of his opponent, that conversion occurred at predictable junctions. Requests climbed a ladder until they reached the rung designed to carry their weight, and then they became orders. In his own world, requests wandered. Some became tasks, some became hopes, some went to ground because the paper that bore them was too honest about the conditions into which the request would fall. The difference expressed itself at the edge of battle where he lived. When he reached for fuel after his seizure, he reached into a mesh of authorities whose priorities did not cohere. A railman promised a wagon on Thursday if a bridge took mercy on it. A depot promised drums if the trucks promised to appear, and the trucks promised to appear if a certain fuel point was open when they arrived. Each promise was conditional and made in good faith. Together they formed a chain with many links, each link crafted by a competent hand, each link just strong enough to break under the weight of need. He did not rage. He measured. He planned his next move with a respect for the fragility that his own experience had taught him to assume. He watched with clinical interest how, across the line, authority simplified the lives of men. One office decided the color of a road for a day, and that color meant something everywhere. Red could be outbound, blue could be return, and no trucker with a map in his lap needed to improvise the rules of a bridge at night. Police on motorcycles acted out the will of a schedule written by people who had never seen the road and did not need to because they trusted their own routines to catch and correct their own mistakes. The colonel found this chilling and admirable in equal measure. Chilling because it suggested a machine that might roll even if its drivers were replaced. Admirable because it showed respect for the principle that lives are spared when decisions are made once, well, and then obeyed. He did not dream of ordering such a system into existence by fiat. He understood the culture that made his own world flexible, where the other was firm, and he understood that culture is an inventory measured in generations, not in weeks. But he did assert, within the territory he controlled, a small version of the principle. He made his fuel point sacred. He gave the job to a man who thought in tables rather than in tales. He insisted that every request for a liter be justified by a route and a role. He angered friends. He protected range. He learned that a commander can become a custodian and remain a commander, and that doing so does not dim his authority. It grounds it. When he signed the evening's release, he did so with the knowledge that each liter he freed had a destination that complemented a purpose instead of a sentence that merely sounded inspiring. Governance then became the story behind his stories. It explained why a raid felt thrilling and a day later felt thin. It explained why the other side seemed to glide. It explained why a tired driver on his team still found the strength to smile when a small rule saved him an hour, and why he scowled when a large rule demanded a compromise he could not accept. It explained his own acceptance on the night when he finally let himself admit that what he had seen was not a failure of courage, but the culmination of 1,000 deliberate choices made by people who would never taste powder. In that admission there was no defeat. There was the peace that comes from naming the forces that moved him, and from promising himself that, as long as he carried responsibility, he would put his thumb on the scale for the kind of authority that makes tomorrow less of a guess. On the morning after the fuel seizure, the unit woke to a promise with edges. The promise said that momentum could be made to last if every decision were measured and no one mistook speed for reach. The edges were the kinds that cut quietly. They hid inside bearings warmed too quickly and tires warmed too long. The colonel looked at the road like a gambler, studies a table he cannot afford to leave and cannot afford to lose. He charted the day as a sequence of small survivals, each one strung to the next with the thin wire of discipline. The first task was motion without extravagance. Drivers coaxed their machines forward as a choir might hold a note steady, unshowy, refusing the cheap drama of a surge. The hedgerows smelled of damp earth and hot metal. The road, always a witness with a long memory, took their weight and offered them the kind of distance that shows itself one cautious kilometre at a time. By mid-morning they met the first interruption, which arrived as a shadow skimming the fields, and a sound that sent fingers to ignitions. The formation dissolved into stillness. Men laid branches across fuselages, draped tarps with the care of tailors, and held their breath because breath is the first thing panic steals. When the sky moved on, they did not talk about luck. They talked about gauges and filters, and the quiet business of resuming. The colonel made a note not about fear, but about time spent, waiting, the most expensive currency in the week ahead. He underlined the word waiting, and then closed the notebook because a commander cannot narrate his worry and retain command. The afternoon offered a crossroads that would tempt a younger officer. A straight lane promised speed. A crooked farm road promised shelter and a kinder grade for old transmissions. He chose the crookedness and paid with minutes so he could save liters. The map protested, as all maps do when practicality humiliates geometry. He ignored it. The column slid along hedges and stone walls and, in a brief clearing, past an orchard where a child stood and did what children do when machines pass. He counted them, lips moving, a citizen of a future that would measure strength in inventories rather than in adjectives. Night did not so much fall as gather, and with it came the familiar problem of where to sleep without teaching the enemy your habits. The first day ended under camouflage nets, stitched together from whatever had survived the previous months. Engines cooled with small tickings that sounded like polite applause. The colonel wrote one sentence: "We bought a day. We must now buy a week." He did not intend it for anyone's eyes. He wrote it to harden his own resolve against the seduction of a single successful act. The second day began with the arithmetic of maintenance. The unit's best mechanics do their noblest work before the front wakes, when oil is cold and bolts argue with fingers. They replaced filters made honest by overwork, tightened clamps that had learned to slip, and tuned engines until their song sounded more like patience than pride. The colonel shortened the morning march to match the reality those mechanics handed him. He had discovered that restraint could be a form of aggression when it preserved strength for the hour, when strength would be asked to decide something larger than an arrival time. That afternoon the road narrowed into a ribbon that seemed to have been laid by someone who had imagined wagons rather than tanks. The column learned a new choreography: staggered halts, brief advances, the understanding that a minute lost to caution can be a minute gained in not having to extract a vehicle from a ditch that loves to keep what it takes. The week acquired a rhythm: mornings for motion, middays for interruptions from above, late afternoons for the choice between prudence and pride, evenings for the small ritual of survival, water, rations, inspections, the friendly tyranny of routine. On the third day, the sky returned with intent. Aircraft circled with the confidence of owners. The unit practiced freezing as if it were a drill composed by an old, exacting master. No one flinched. No one wasted a glance. Stillness became craft. When the danger passed, the drivers did not punish their engines with sudden speed to make up the lost minutes. They eased forward, proving that patience and range are siblings. The colonel felt the pride that professionals permit themselves, not in the glamorous dash, but in the refusal to panic. He told himself that panic is a fuel thief. The fourth day was the day of parts. A courier brought news polite in its cruelty. "What you asked for is coming as quickly as we can make its coming ordinary." That sentence could serve as a national motto for a certain kind of war. Cannibalization spread like ivy, slow and beautiful to the desperate. Vehicles surrendered mirrors, springs, a length of hose, a switch. No one had thought precious until darkness refused to accept headlamps that would not answer. The colonel authorized each exchange only after forcing himself to say aloud what would be lost next week because of what was saved today. Command lived in that willingness to name the later cost. The fifth day delivered rumor that traveled faster than any truck. "Reinforcements," someone said, and the rumor put color in cheeks and an inch of recklessness in a few wrists. The colonel killed it with clarity. There would be help when a schedule elsewhere allowed help, and the schedule elsewhere belonged to a world that had learned to prefer procedures to promises. He taught his men that the most adult form of hope is planning. Then he marched them along a route that contained both risk and grace, a stretch of road that ran beneath trees so old they seemed to remember wars that had required more hay than oil. On the sixth day, the enemy did not throw a wall. He raised a hedge. Machine guns spoke, and then fell silent. Mortars coughed. A sniper wrote a sentence of irritation across the hood of a staff car and then disappeared. The unit leaned on infantry the way a tired runner leans on a railing. Small assaults cleared small nests. The colonel spent fuel as if it were a signature he wanted to remain legible. He paid for caution with time and bought freedom from catastrophe. If an historian had been standing there, he would have yawned. If a mechanic had been standing there, he would have nodded. The seventh day arrived without ceremony. One truck was gone to the graveyard of useful donors. One gun's breech felt stiffer than it should under a careful hand. One driver woke with his hands swollen from the grip that keeps a heavy machine straight on a narrow lane. The colonel looked at these three small facts and saw the whole week in miniature. Progress measured in a language that refuses large claims. He gathered his officers at dusk and laid out the next 7 days the way a farmer lays out a harvest plan when he knows the weather will not be friendly. The week's flowchart fit on a single page. Move early. Hide well. Repair first. Fight only for ground that buys tomorrow. Treat rumor like smoke. Let routine make courage cheap. No one applauded. Everyone understood. The colonel kept his account not because he loved numbers, though he did, but because numbers love men who take them seriously. He recorded every litre that entered the life of his unit and every litre that left. He noted the distances earned from each day's consumption and the distances denied by each day's delay. He wrote the names of vehicles, the way a shepherd writes the names of sheep, and kept beside them a simple grammar of health. Runs, limps, rests, begs. The page was not elegant. It was faithful. Faithfulness made him honest about what had been gained in the raid and what had been merely borrowed from the stubborn future. Replacement announced itself in the sounds of a working rear echelon. Crates thumped onto platforms. Nails protested and then accepted their fate. A crane turned in a lazy circle like a patient planet. A driver with a pencil tucked above his ear recited part numbers faster than a poet can recite a favorite stanza. There is beauty in repetition when repetition prevents grief. The colonel listened to that music when he could and reminded himself that the other side owned a symphony of such sounds, conducted by men who had perfected the art of making the exceptional feel routine. He did not resent them, that art. He built a chamber orchestra of his own and made do. Depletion wrote its counterpoint in narrower notes. It did not shout, it scratched. A filter clogged and was cleaned and clogged again. A bearing sang a little louder each afternoon. A starter stuttered for a heartbeat 2 days in a row, and then, as if ashamed of the attention, behaved for a while longer. The colonel came to recognize the voices of his machines, the way a physician learns the voices of hearts through a stethoscope. He could tell when a complaint was theatre and when it was a warning that wanted an answer before noon. He grew gentler as a commander because gentleness served the ledger better than zeal. He wrote at the bottom of each day an equation that did not change. We can inflict loss faster than we can repair ourselves, and they can repair themselves faster than we can inflict loss. It was not a cry of surrender. It was a frame. Frames give pictures, definition instead of despair. Within that frame he painted days that mattered. He spent ammunition where it would save fuel tomorrow. He postponed an advance if postponement spared a gearbox from the kind of heat that turns victory at noon into immobility at 2. He allowed an enemy position to live until dusk if daylight would have charged too high a price for the same ground. He thought often about the way abundance alters manners. Men who trust replacement do not lie about damage. They report it and return to duty in the morning with a machine that behaves. Men who distrust replacement learn to whisper about damage until the whisper becomes a habit, and then the habit becomes a culture, and then the culture becomes a sentence. He broke that sentence whenever he caught it forming. He told his drivers, "Tell me the truth while the truth is cheap." He told his mechanics, "Condemn what should be condemned." He told himself, "Regret is more expensive than candor." On rare afternoons, the ledger gave him a gift. A shipment arrived early or contained exactly the thing he had begun to fear he would never see again, a part small enough to hide in a pocket and important enough to keep a company mobile. He allowed a smile and then returned to the arithmetic that ran the rest of his life. He never let gifts teach him habits. Habits were learned from what arrived on time most days, not from what arrived early some days. That is how he kept the account clean of illusions. At last he wrote on a page that had grown soft with handling a line he intended for the man who would replace him someday. Treat your ledger like a map. It will show you which roads are fantasies and which are promises. It will tell you when to be brave and when to be boring. It will teach you that nothing is more romantic than a machine that starts every morning. The line looked sentimental when he examined it at dusk. At dawn it looked like law. He granted himself no witnesses. He sat alone on a crate by the fuel point with his cap in his lap, and the smell of gasoline turning the air metallic. The confession did not arrive as drama. It arrived as relief. He admitted that daring could carve a shape in the afternoon, but only capacity could give that shape a shadow at sunset. He admitted that he had spent years worshipping talent when he should have been worshipping craft. He admitted, finally, that he loved his men too much to spend them on the altar of eloquent plans. The words did not diminish him. They made room for a better kind of pride. He looked at the map with a tenderness he had once reserved for instruments. He folded it along the creases carefully and smoothed the tears with tape, as if he were repairing a garment that had belonged to a father. He saw in its lines 100 places where he had asked a road to be braver than its construction allowed. He saw the bridges that had failed not because the enemy hated them, but because physics disliked arrogance. He saw how often he had commissioned speed to perform miracles, and how faithfully speed had tried before it had handed him back the invoice with interest due. Decisions reorganized themselves. He resolved to buy time with discipline instead of with spectacle. He resolved to ask his youngest officers to plan for second days and third days, and to write their orders as if maintenance were a maneuver. He resolved to treat every litre as a wage paid by an exhausted nation to men who deserved to see morning. He would still move quickly when moving quickly, promised a return greater than the risk. He would still spring a trap when the geometry of roads and hedges and human expectation offered him the pleasure of exactness. He would simply refuse to mistake one fine afternoon for a strategy. After he had absorbed the shape of this new humility, he did what men do when they have made a decision that must become more than a thought. He walked the line. He put his palm to the hoods of vehicles, checking for heat that lingers too long. He spoke with drivers about the art of saving distance with a light foot. He asked a mechanic whether a certain cough meant an adjustment or a prayer. He thanked the man responsible for the fuel point and told him that he would be stingier tomorrow because stinginess would keep more of them alive. The man nodded in the honest way of those who understand that thrift is a kind of courage. When he gathered his officers that night, he offered them neither apology nor sermon. He offered them a plan drawn with a pencil sharpened to an unromantic point. It measured success by the number of vehicles at start line +1, by the quality of concealment at midday, by the cleanliness of filters at dusk. It dared less and accomplished more. Some were disappointed by the absence of thunder. Most found after a day or two that thunder had never been their friend. They liked living. They liked obeying orders that fit the world they inhabited. They liked a commander who had exchanged eloquence for exactness. That is what the private admission finally meant, a quiet rejection of theatre in favor of practice. He did not become less brave. He became picky about what bravery should buy. He asked it to purchase distance and survival rather than applause. In the privacy of his thoughts, he smiled at the extravagance he had abandoned and the dignity he had chosen, and then he slept the best sleep a commander ever gets. The sleep bought with the knowledge that tomorrow's plan will not ask the impossible of anyone. This story will travel. It will be carried by people who crave endings that gleam, and people who value the quiet that keeps men alive. Some will say the raid proved that ingenuity can make history kneel. Others will say it proved that quantity crushes quality. Both readings miss what the roadside taught. The lesson given without ornament is that systems write the final paragraphs of any campaign, and that a courageous sentence sits inside those paragraphs and does its work best when it knows where it belongs. To read such a story wisely is to listen for the sound under the sound, the crane in the port, the driver counting kilometers with a gentle foot, the mechanic naming the noise that means stop now or pay later. Begin with replenishment. Ask what disappeared by noon when the drums were taken, and then ask what reappeared by midnight because a schedule insisted on it. If the loss returned to the ledger quickly and without ceremony, the story is a bright spark on a wet branch. It flares. It warms a few hands. It does not burn the forest. If the loss rippled through timetables for days, then you may be in the presence of something larger than a morning's gamble. This way of looking is not cynical. It is respectful of the people who labor in warehouses and rail yards and who save lives by making boredom a wall the enemy cannot breach. Look next at ownership. Who decides which road carries which load? Who tells a convoy when to move and when to wait, and how far apart its members must travel to arrive together? Victory has many fathers in speeches, and surprisingly few in reality. One of them is the office that can change the color of a road on a map and make that color law for a day. The colonel learned to respect that power because he saw what happened when it was scattered among offices that meant well and could not agree fast enough to keep engines from starving. And then, always, choose the 7-day view over the 7-minute thrill. A morning is easily stolen. A week requires humility. The week asks whether the captured fuel turned into enduring options or merely into loud hours. It asks whether the men who seized it were handed a routine that could keep them from dying of their own success. It asks, hardest of all, whether the other side's calm is the softness of complacency or the hardness of competence. The weak has the courtesy to answer those questions in full sentences, carry the calm ethic elsewhere. In any endeavor that tempts you to worship talent or drama, remember that habit turns talent into a guarantee and drama into a footnote. The men who sorted crates at the port and stamped forms without error and taught drivers not to waste tires were artists whose canvases happened to be made of timber and steel and paper. Their art looks like boredom to people who admire only fireworks. It looks like mercy to those who count the living at sunset. If you tell this story, keep the numbers close and the metaphors on a leash. Describe how many kilometers a liter buys on a dry road and on a rutted one. Describe how many hours a clean filter adds to an engine's patience. Describe how likely it is that a convoy traveling under a strict plan will arrive within a promised window. And then, if you must, lift your eyes and speak of courage, but do it after you have honored the clerks, the mechanics, and the men who turned rules into safety. They are the reason the daring of a single day becomes a chapter rather than a cautionary tale. The colonel accepted that truth without bitterness. He walked into the rest of his command with a loyalty to routine he once reserved for audacity. He remained a fighter because fighting was still asked of him. He became a custodian as well, because custody is what keeps fighters from wasting themselves. In that combination, he found a peace that does not announce itself with trumpets. It shows in the way a unit wakes before dawn and moves without shouting, in the way engines turn over at first light, in the way a road that once felt like a gamble becomes, for an hour,